Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the review and recap series for OCR History B, Crime and Punishment. So just like in the previous video, this is actually the second time that I've recorded an episode on medieval law enforcement. Again, the reason for this is that in the original video that I uploaded, I spoke a lot about things like how effective the law enforcement was, and upon reviewing it, I don't think that was particularly the best way of going about the video. So please watch this updated version, make some new notes as we go along, and then we'll talk about obviously the different types of law enforcement as we go through, as well as some changes and continuities that you need to be aware of. So what was medieval law enforcement like? Well, first things first, the king. The king is at the very top of this system. We obviously spoke about the feudal system a couple of episodes ago, and when it comes to law enforcement, it was the king who was the most powerful person. At the time, it was believed that God had appointed the king, which was known as the divine right of kings or the divine right of monarchs. And if you break the law, you were also breaking the king's peace, and you would often have to pay a fine, which would work its way to him. So he is the one that sets the tone with law enforcement. He is the one that appoints the officials underneath him. However, the king relied on the people very heavily during this particular period of history. The people were expected to be the ones who upheld the king's peace. It was their responsibility to hunt for criminals. And two examples of this that we can be aware of are the hue and cry and tithings. So the hue and cry, as I'm sure you can remember from your lessons, are where a loud noise or a bell would ring out, and the whole village would have to down their tools. So if they were in the middle of farming or whatever they were doing, they would have to put everything down, and they were expected to hunt for the criminal in the village. If somebody ignored the hue and cry, the whole village would receive a fine as a punishment for not upholding the king's peace. So it was the people's responsibility, not the government's at this time, to uphold the law. Another example of how the people upheld the law at this time is the examples of tithings. A tithing is just when 4 men would be grouped together in a village, and if one of those 4 men broke the law, it would be the responsibility for the other 3 to take that particular person to a court where they would sit in front of a judge, most likely a manor court. If they didn't bring their 4th person in for a trial, then they could expect to receive a punishment as well. So this was just another way of making sure that everybody in a village knew their role in law enforcement and made sure that everybody was kind of keeping an eye on each other. There were some officials as well during this time. So obviously you've got the king, the people, but there were some officials as well who would oversee parts of law enforcement. The Parish Constable was first introduced in the 1250s, and it would be their responsibility to lead the hue and cry and supplied armed men to the king from a particular county. It was an unpaid and an amateur job, so they wouldn't receive any salary for this, because at this particular moment in history, there wasn't a taxation system in place to pay for this. And they only held their job for 1 year at a time. So there was lots of change year on year with parish constables. Other examples of officials that were unpaid and amateur at this time are the sheriff and his posse. The sheriff then was the king's personal agent in each county. They were often a powerful lord. They wouldn't be paid for their job, as I've already said, but they would get a share of any property that was taken from a criminal in the event of an arrest. What would the sheriff do? Well, the sheriff would track down the criminal if they'd managed to escape the hue and cry, and he would use his posse, which was a group of men over the age of 15, who would help track down the wanted person. What other officials existed? Well, you get the coroner. The coroner would inquire, which means research, into unnatural deaths to try and find evidence of criminal activity. However, one of the problems with this was that there are only 4 coroners in each county, which meant that often by the time that a coroner had got to a particular place, the body was in a pretty bad state and you wouldn't be able to work out a lot about it. Another significant part of law enforcement that you need to be aware of, and it's something that often students tend to overlook, is the court system. The court system is very important in the medieval period because once the criminal has been caught, they need to obviously be sent somewhere to be decided whether they are innocent or guilty. There are 4 types of court in the medieval period. The first type of court that you need to be aware of is the royal court. This was the most serious type of court, where serious cases like homicide would be listened to. You also get quarter sessions. These were run by justices of peace increasingly throughout the period, and they were held 4 times a year in each county. They would listen to a mixture of serious and petty crimes. Manor courts were courts that were basically in the homes of the local lord in a village. They would often deal with local crimes such as wages, problems to do with wages, so whether somebody was paying somebody too much on a local farm. and the lord would oversee that. Wealthy villagers in the area would sit on the jury in this particular case. You also had church courts. Church courts were the destination for people who committed moral crimes. In a church court, there wasn't a jury, and it would be the priest who would decide on your particular punishment. At this time, you also need to be aware that juries were made up in a very different way to how we think of juries today. Juries in the medieval period had to know the accused, they had to be from the same village, and there wasn't any expectation to use evidence in a medieval trial. In fact, most medieval trials only lasted about 20 minutes, and the reason for that is because it would simply be a case of using character sort of testimony. So how well did they know the villager? Did they like that villager? Were they well liked in their particular area? And often what you find is somebody from outside of the village, so for an example a vagrant, would be far more likely to be executed and sentenced to death because they weren't known by the villager, and therefore the villagers didn't particularly have any reason to find them not guilty. They didn't care about them in the same way. On the flip side of that, if the villager was well known, what the jury would often try and do is reduce the kind of sentence that person would get because they wouldn't want to see them executed necessarily. So like I said, there's no sort of use of evidence as we might think of in a court today. So what are some of the key changes and continuities that you need to be aware of with the medieval period, within the medieval period itself? The reason that I've done a slide on this is because one of the questions that have come up in past papers has been, well, how much change was there in the medieval period? And students often struggle to think of this because they don't necessarily know what came beforehand. We don't need to think of it always in that way, because you can think about changes and continuities within the medieval period itself. So in terms of key changes then, one of the most significant changes in this time period is the Justices of Peace. They come into being in the 1360s, in 1361, and this signals a move by the king to start to use a more centralised justice system. It's now the king appointing officials to oversee law enforcement in certain areas. This was a big change, as the county sheriff used to run something called the 100 Court, and in 1388 the Justices of Peace increasingly take over the role of Court of Sessions. So the JP's power is growing within the medieval period as they're now running the Court of Sessions, and they've taken over the 100 Courts which were used by the sheriffs. Be very careful, because the power of the JPs also increases in the early modern period, so you just need to know which change occurs in which time period. Other changes include the fact that King Edward I introduced the Royal Court in 1293, again signifying a move towards a more centralised court system. Manor courts throughout the medieval period lose their influence. That's again because the king is using his officials more than local lords to uphold the law. In terms of key continuities, there are lots of continuities within the medieval period going into the early modern period. It's the people's expectation to uphold the law. At the time, it is not believed it is the responsibility of the king or the government to uphold the law on a daily basis. And this kind of stems from the fact that the king simply doesn't have the resources to uphold the law without the public's loyalty. He doesn't have a tax system in place. He doesn't have the money in place to pay for a police system that we see in the industrial period. Another key theme throughout this period when it comes to law enforcement is that all officials were unpaid and amateur. They weren't professionally trained and they were not paid for their services, which is often why you see them being local lords, because they would be the ones with the power already in the local area, and it would give them a lot of status. It would give them a lot of power in a local area to be a member of the law enforcement. There's no police force. Obviously, as we've already said, that's a continuity throughout the medieval and the early modern period. That's not going to change until we get the Bow Street Runners and the Metropolitan Police Force in the 1750s and 1820s. And finally, when it came to reporting crime, the onus, the responsibility for that was on the victim. Today, if you are the victim of a crime, it will be the Crown Prosecution Service and the police who will sort that out for you. But in the medieval period, it was your responsibility as the victim of crime to bring that person to justice. Now, that often created lots of problems, because we know from the medieval period that often the victims of crime were very poor people. We know that there was often times when wealthy villagers, powerful people in local villages would accuse somebody much poorer, somebody much weaker of a crime, and that meant that they weren't able to defend themselves in the same way. So there are huge power imbalance issues in the medieval period that you need to be aware of. And like I said, because it was the responsibility of the victim to bring that person to justice, lots of criminals were often never brought to justice because of that. This just about wraps up our third episode of the review and recap series for Crime and Punishment. I hope you found this video useful. Please continue watching, because in the next video we're going to be talking about medieval punishment. Thank you for listening.